You think you know Britain's most famous trucks. You don't. For decades, Eddie Stobart's green and red lorries were a British cult phenomenon. Fans chased them. Millions obsessed over the women's names painted on the cabs. But behind those spotless paint jobs, the empire was secretly bleeding to death. While the public kept waving from motorway bridges, the real Eddie Stobart was quietly erased. Today, the trucks you pass on the moon are a corporate illusion, a ghost fleet operated by an invisible giant you've probably never heard of. This is the hidden truth behind the greatest stealth takeover in British history. We are breaking down the shocking timeline of how a national treasure died, who really pulls the strings today, and the dark reason they desperately need you to believe the Stobart myth is still alive. Eddie Stobart's story began back in the 1950s, not with massive fleets, but with a single second-hand fertilizer spreader and a big dream. Eddie Stobart, the company's founder, started his agricultural contracting business in the small Cumbrian village of Heskett, Newmarket, with just £800 and an unshakable work ethic. The early years were anything but glamorous. Stobart spent his days spreading fertilizer across the fields of the Lake District, earning barely enough to keep his young family fed. His wife, Nora, supported the business by keeping the books, while Eddie worked 18-hour days trying to build something sustainable from almost nothing. The transformation from agricultural contractor to freight giant truly began after Eddie purchased his very first truck, a second-hand Guy Invincible, back in 1960. He started hauling agricultural feed and fertilizer for local farmers. But the monumental turning point came in 1976, when his son, Edward Stobart Jr., officially took over the transport side of the newly incorporated business. It was a modest handover, but it marked the exact moment when Eddie Stobart evolved from a local operation into something with massive potential for growth. What set Stobart apart from other small haulers wasn't just his work ethic, but his attention to detail and presentation. Even in those early days, he insisted that his trucks should be clean, well-maintained, and professionally presented. This obsession with image would later become one of the company's defining characteristics and a major factor in its eventual cult following. The decision to adopt the distinctive green and red livery came in 1981, inspired by the colours of the Christian Salvesen fleet that Stobart had seen operating in Scotland. But it was Eddie's son, Edward Stobart Jr., who would transform these practical design choices into something approaching genius-level brand marketing. When Edward Jr. took over the business in the mid-1980s, he brought with him a vision that went far beyond simply moving goods from point A to point B. He understood instinctively that in the world of road transport, image was everything. The trucks became mobile billboards, each one immaculately maintained and bearing a woman's name in elegant script across the cab. The naming tradition began when Edward Jr. named his very first truck after the iconic 1960s fashion model Twiggy, and this quickly evolved into a highly sophisticated system that completely captured the British public's imagination. Names were carefully chosen to reflect British culture and values. You'd find trucks named after members of the royal family, historical figures, and even suggestions from the growing community of Eddie Stobart enthusiasts. By the 1990s, Eddie Stobart had transformed from a regional hauler into a national phenomenon. The company's expansion was aggressive and strategic, with new depots opening across England and Scotland. The fleet grew from dozens to hundreds of trucks, each one contributing to the growing mythology of the Eddie Stobart brand. The company's success wasn't built solely on marketing genius, though that certainly played a part. Eddie Stobart had genuinely revolutionized the British logistics industry by focusing on reliability, punctuality, and customer service. Their just-in-time delivery systems helped major retailers streamline their operations, while their commitment to driver training and vehicle maintenance set new industry standards. The official Eddie Stobart Fan Club, which was formally established in 1992, represented something completely unprecedented in the world of commercial road transport. Thousands of dedicated members paid annual fees just to receive newsletters, attend truck rallies, and gain access to exclusive Eddie Stobart merchandise. The company had achieved what most marketing executives can only dream of. They'd turned customers into evangelists and converted a functional service into an emotional brand experience. Television programs featuring Eddie Stobart drivers became surprise hits, drawing audiences that had no professional connection to the transport industry. People who couldn't change a tire found themselves fascinated by the daily routines of long-haul drivers and the complex logistics of managing a nationwide trucking operation. The peak of Eddie Stobart's cultural impact came in the early 2000s, when the sight of their trucks had become so synonymous with British motorways that holiday games centered around spotting them. Children would compete to see who could count the most Eddie Stobart trucks during family car journeys, while adults found themselves unconsciously noting the names painted on passing cabs. But beneath this remarkable public success, the financial foundations of Eddie Stobart were becoming increasingly unstable. The aggressive expansion that had fueled the company's growth was also creating dangerous levels of debt. The logistics industry operates on notoriously thin margins, and Eddie Stobart's commitment to maintaining their premium image was becoming increasingly expensive. The company had invested heavily in new trucks, state-of-the-art facilities, and cutting-edge technology, all while facing intense competition from larger European operators who could undercut their prices. The beautiful trucks that had made Eddie Stobart famous were also making them financially vulnerable, as their operating costs exceeded those of competitors who prioritized efficiency over aesthetics. Financial pressures intensified throughout the 2000s as fuel costs soared and the economic climate became increasingly challenging. Eddie Stobart found themselves trapped between their brand promise of premium service and the brutal economic realities of the modern transport industry. The company that had once seemed invincible was showing clear signs of strain. Management changes became frequent as the Stobart family struggled to adapt their beloved company to changing market conditions. Edward Stobart Jr., the visionary who had built the brand, found himself increasingly sidelined as investors and financial advisors took greater control over strategic decisions. The warning signs were there for anyone who cared to look. Delivery schedules became less reliable, customer complaints increased, and the famously pristine trucks began showing signs of deferred maintenance. The Eddie Stobart that appeared in public remained as polished as ever, but industry insiders knew that serious problems were brewing behind the scenes. By 2010, Eddie Stobart was in genuine financial distress. The company had accumulated debts that far exceeded their ability to service them through normal operations. Despite still being one of the most recognizable brands in British transport, Eddie Stobart was hemorrhaging money at an unsustainable rate. The first major crisis hit in 2014 when Eddie Stobart entered administration, a form of corporate insolvency that provided temporary protection from creditors while administrators attempted to restructure the business or find a buyer. For the thousands of Eddie Stobart fans who had followed the company's fortunes for decades, the news came as a devastating shock. The administration process revealed the true extent of Eddie Stobart's financial problems. Years of aggressive expansion, combined with industry-wide pressures and management missteps, had created a debt mountain that threatened to bury one of Britain's most beloved brands forever. However, Eddie Stobart's brand value remained significant even in administration. The trucks were still iconic, the customer base was still loyal, and the operational infrastructure was largely intact. What the company needed was a buyer with deep pockets and the expertise to navigate the complex world of modern logistics. This is where Culina entered the picture, though their involvement was far from obvious to casual observers. Culina Group had been operating in the background of the British food and drink industry for decades, providing specialized logistics services to retailers and manufacturers who preferred to keep their supply chain operations invisible to consumers. Founded in 1994, Culina Group had steadily built their flawless reputation by focusing on the complex requirements of temperature-controlled transport and warehousing. While Eddie Stobart was becoming a household name, Culina was quietly developing unparalleled expertise in the less glamorous but highly profitable world of chilled and frozen food logistics. Culina's approach to business was the complete opposite of Eddie Stobart's brand-focused strategy. They prioritized operational efficiency over public recognition, preferring to let their results speak for themselves rather than courting media attention. This fundamental difference in philosophy would prove crucial when Culina eventually absorbed much of Eddie Stobart's operations. In 2014, when Eddie Stobart emerged from administration under new ownership, the company survived, but its deep financial vulnerabilities quietly persisted behind the scenes. The arrangement kept the trucks running, but industry analysts understood that structural problems were still undermining what the public considered to be Eddie Stobart operations. The devastating blow occurred in August 2019 when Eddie Stobart faced a massive accounting scandal that resulted in the immediate suspension of trading on the London Stock Exchange. After a temporary rescue by investment firm DBAY Advisors, the writing was clearly on the wall. The final transformation officially occurred in July 2021. This time, there was no dramatic rescue or massive public campaign to save the family legacy. Instead, Culina Group officially acquired the holding company of Eddie Stobart Logistics, effectively absorbing the viable operations. The genius of this monumental acquisition was that it completely preserved the visible Eddie Stobart brand while allowing Culina to aggressively implement the operational efficiencies that Eddie Stobart had never achieved. Culina left behind the crippling debt, taking only the brand name and the operational network of what had once been Britain's most famous independent trucking company. Today, when you see those familiar red and green trucks on British motorways, you're looking at vehicles that are owned and operated by Culina Group, not Eddie Stobart. The names are still painted on the cabs, the livery remains unchanged, and the trucks still maintain the high standards that made Eddie Stobart famous. But the company behind them is fundamentally different. Culina has succeeded where Eddie Stobart failed by focusing on operational excellence rather than brand building. They've maintained the visual elements that made Eddie Stobart beloved while implementing the cost controls and efficiency measures that Eddie Stobart never mastered. It's a perfect example of how modern corporate logistics can preserve the appearance of tradition while completely transforming the underlying reality. The drivers who operate these trucks today work for Culina, not Eddie Stobart. The depots that dispatch them are managed by Culina systems, not Eddie Stobart procedures. The customers who receive deliveries are served by Culina's logistics network, not Eddie Stobart's operational structure. What Culina has achieved is perhaps the most successful stealth takeover in British corporate history. They've acquired the operational benefits of one of the country's most valuable transport brands while avoiding the financial burdens and management problems that ultimately destroyed the original company. For the general public, very little has changed. The trucks still rumble down the motorways, the names still grace the cabs, and Eddie Stobart spotters can continue their beloved hobby without interruption. But for anyone who understands the realities of modern business, the Eddie Stobart story represents a fascinating case study in how corporate identity can survive even when corporate reality has been completely transformed. The hidden truth behind Culina's replacement of Eddie Stobart's legacy isn't a story of corporate villainy or hostile takeover. Instead, it's a demonstration of how modern business can preserve the things that customers value while discarding the operational failures that threaten sustainability. Culina deserves credit for recognizing the value in Eddie Stobart's brand and finding a way to preserve it when others might have simply liquidated the assets and moved on. They've maintained employment for thousands of drivers and logistics workers, preserved relationships with long-standing customers, and kept alive a piece of British cultural heritage that might otherwise have disappeared forever. The Eddie Stobart brand continues to thrive under Culina's stewardship, but it's no longer the independent family business that captured the nation's imagination. It's become something more typical of modern commerce, a carefully managed brand asset operated by professional logistics specialists who understand that efficiency and profitability matter more than sentiment and tradition. Whether this transformation represents progress or loss depends largely on your perspective. Those who valued Eddie Stobart for its operational excellence and customer service might argue that Culina has improved upon the original. Those who cherished Eddie Stobart as a symbol of British entrepreneurship and family business might mourn what has been lost in the transition. What's undeniable is that Culina has succeeded in preserving the visible elements of Eddie Stobart while completely remaking the invisible infrastructure that makes those trucks run on time. In doing so, they've demonstrated that in the modern economy, brand preservation and operational transformation can coexist successfully, even when most people never realize that fundamental change has occurred.